The Snuggle Play Dress is inspired by my rambunctious 3-year-old Mariana, who wants to get dressed all by herself, but also loves playing in dresses. So the top is more like a simple sweatshirt style, but with special embroidery on the front, and then the bottom is just a simple woven skirt. The first dress that I made was with a sweatshirt material on the top, and the Janome embroidery can go through just about any material, so don't worry about that. Your PDF is going to explain exactly the amount of materials you'll need for the top and the skirt. To do the embroidery on the machine, choose whatever colors you desire, and depending on how many colors your particular design has. I'm going to be doing a pretty little butterfly design with 3 different colors of embroidery thread that actually match back to the fabric on the bottom. The first dress I did used this sweatshirt material, which works out really well, but this time I think I'm going to do more of a simple t-shirt knit, and one that coordinates really beautiful with this pretty Liberty of London print here. I also have some really pretty shades of embroidery thread to choose from to coordinate with that Liberty of London fabric. And also I'm going to choose 3 of them because I'm going to do this pretty interlocking butterfly design that has 3 different colors. The embroidery design that I chose on the Skyline S9 is going to use the hoop 20, so I've got that ready to go. I also have some stabilizer that I'm going to put behind my fabric. You'll also want your basic sewing supplies. So I have my straight pins, my thread snips, and some marking tools. I also have my cutting mat and my rotary cutter to cut out the very simple pattern shapes. And you'll want to choose some machine sewing thread just to coordinate with your fabrics. Before we get started on embroidery, I want to give you a couple of tips to consider when embroidering on a piece of fabric that will become the part of a garment. You want to first embroider but not cut out your pattern shape yet, although in this case we're going to want to center the design on that bodice front. So I'm going to use my chalk pencil just to mark it out on the fabric. Now you'll notice I don't have it pushed all the way up here. I've got it kind of a little bit more down here so that I have a nice border of fabric all the way around, and that correlates with the size hoop that I'm using right here. I want the fabric to be able to extend past the hoop on all sides when I go to embroider it, so I'm giving it a little bit of a border here. But I'm just going to mark with my chalk. I'm just going to do a light pencil or chalk line around here to get that pattern shape in. It doesn't have to be perfect. You're not going to necessarily cut on these lines later. This just gives you an idea as you're hooping the fabric. Now to get it really nice and centered, you'll need to pay attention to these center marks here at the top and the bottom. And I'm making chalk marks at both sides. And even though this extends beyond the pattern, that's okay. That's going to help me line up the center of my pattern shape in the embroidery hoop with this fancy little grid overlay that helps you center your fabric. So now I'm going to include this material in the hooping process. I'm taking out the top hoop, and I'm going to layer the stabilizer right on top of the lower hoop, and then the fabric comes next, which for right now you can just sort of eyeball the center of that. And then I'm just going to loosely lay the top hoop over it. And even these markings here, these little ridges on the top hoop, can point out where the center is. And we're pretty close. I'm just going to scoot it over a little bit. But I'm also going to use this grid to help me line everything up. Now another consideration, of course, is also how high or low you want the embroidery to sit. So this center mark here and these side centering marks are going to help you with that. I love the Skyline S9 because it is so simple to switch from regular sewing to embroidery. Notice that the design is oriented sideways to fit in the hoop, so I also have my pattern shape oriented sideways in the hoop to embroider it just where I want it. Now that we've embroidered these pretty little trio of butterflies across the front of the fabric, it's time to take our sewing pattern pieces and cut out that bodice piece. I've retraced mine on some Swedish tracing paper, which I really like because you can still kind of see through it, but it's also easy to work with and it doesn't crease like paper does. I can still just barely see the chalk line of this pattern shape from before the embroidery, but I can definitely still see my center lines. So I can place the pattern. But if there has been any shifting in your embroidery, take a really good look at where the embroidery ended up, because now's your chance to make sure you have it centered where you want it. And I think this looks really good because that chalk line will go away. So if you need to shift it in one direction or another to get the embroidery where you want it, go ahead and do that now. I'm just going to use my rotary to cut around this shape. That's another thing I like about the Swedish tracing paper is it has a little bit of a fabric-y feel to it. So it kind of grips onto your material and doesn't slide around like tracing paper might. You also have pattern pieces for the bodice back and also the sleeve. So you'll cut one bodice back from the same material, or different if you want to mix it up. And then you're also going to cut out 2 sleeves. So you have the 3 pattern pieces, but in addition to that, your downloadable pattern PDF is going to specify which size rectangle to cut for the neckband and also for the skirt pieces. Now that we have all of our pieces cut, it's time to assemble the top together. So I'm just going to be working with the knit fabrics first. And the sleeve piece is the only one that I really want you to pay attention to in terms of which is front and which is back, because they're shaped just a little bit differently. The sleeve piece is the only one that's not perfectly symmetrical. You can see there's a front edge marked and a back edge marked. These are the edges that connect to the front and back pieces. So I'm just going to mark the fronts with pins so that I remember. So in terms of assembly, the front is connected to the back by way of the sleeves. So I'm going to lay it all out here in a way that helps you visualize it. If your fabric has a right and wrong side, make sure that you've got the right side of the back and the right side of the front facing up. And these are my sleeve pieces. And I've got the right sides facing up right now. And this would be the correct orientation because remember, I pin marked the front edge of those sleeves. But I'm going to lay them right sides together now with the front matching up those edges and then pinning together. And now I'm going to do the same on the other side, right sides together. The assembly seams in this dress are done with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to do that now, sewing from the underarm up to the neckline, and then from the neckline down to the underarm on the other side. Now that we've got the front sewn to the sleeves, it's time to do the same with the back. So you see I had it laid out here, oriented well, but we need to turn right sides together. We're going to match these edges and pin. Carry this other sleeve edge over. Okay, now I'm going to sew those seams just the way I did to the front. So now that we have that put together, it's time to put front and back together with the right sides facing. And we're going to do the underarm and the side seam all in one pass by starting here, sewing until we reach that shoulder seam, and then continuing down the side seam. But before I do that, I'm going to press these seams open here. Another great feature on this S9 is that I can set a default so the presser foot automatically raises as soon as I'm done with my seam, which makes doing a pivot turn completely hands-free. After I sewed the underarm edges, I also clipped out some of the excess in the underarm there and pressed it open, both the sleeve and the side seam, so that it all lays nice and smooth. The next step is attach the neckband. Your pattern PDF is going to specify the exact size length of strip to cut depending on what size garment you're making. Then you'll need to fold that long strip with the wrong sides together and press a crease. And then the next step is going to be to sew the two short edges together using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, pressing open, and then you're going to re-establish that folded edge. So what you'll have once that's sewn together and pressed is a really nice, smooth, turned neckband ready to attach to the top neckline of the bodice. Right? This is really simple to sew once you've exposed the free arm of the machine. And I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Take your time subtly stretching that neckband to fit the neckline of the bodice. I love how this bodice is turning out, and now it's time to work on the skirt. The first thing that I'm going to do is make a couple rows of basting stitches at the top of both of these skirt panels. I've got a front panel and a back panel, and really they're just two rectangles, but find your top edge, especially if your fabric is directional, and we're going to work on some basting stitches. I'm going to refer to the sewing applications and the recommended foot for basting. It tells me here to use the A foot, which I already have on the machine, and I'm gonna do the first seam at 3/8 of an inch away from the edge. I'm also gonna start about an inch or so in from the side seam edge. Be sure and leave nice long tails at the end of your basting seams instead of using the automatic cutter. And now we're going to do another line parallel to the first, but at a 5/8 seam allowance. Once you've sewn parallel lines of 3/8 inch and 5/8 inch away from the top edge of one piece, you can do the same on the second piece. So now that both skirt pieces are basted across the top, it's time to gather them up. And we're not going to completely finish the gathering process until we've attached it to the top to make sure that we have it exactly the size that we need, but I'm just going to begin now by pulling the top threads and treating them like a drawstring to spread gathers evenly across the front. Your pattern PDF will describe the width that you need to shrink this top edge down to, but really eyeballing it with the bodice here is a pretty good way to figure it out. So I've got a pretty good amount of gathers here. Instead of pushing them all the way over, I'm going to go down here to the other end and grab these top threads and start gathering from this side until your gathers sort of meet in the middle and the whole top edge is gathered. And this is a nice starchy cotton, so they sort of hold in place really well without you having to tie them off or pin the threads around the ends or anything like that. So I'm just going to leave that one as it is right now because it looks pretty close, maybe a little too small. If it's a little too small to fit your bodice top, you can kind of pull it out. Don't forget, we're still going to be taking 1/2 inch seam allowances. So I'm going to leave that the way that it is right now and work on the other piece in just the same way. I have the top pieces of the skirts both gathered up, and I'm just leaving those tails that I used as drawstrings loose and out of my way because I still might want to adjust the gathers as we go to attach it to the bodice. So I'm going to begin by doing a very scant seam allowance here, just about 1/8 of an inch all the way down one side. So after doing that teeny tiny little seam, I've pressed it to one side, and now I'm gonna flip so that the skirt is front and back right sides together. And I'm gonna find that seam, and this time I'm gonna create another seam. So you can see the first tiny little seam is here. And I'm gonna fold the fabric front and back right sides together so that that seam is out on the very edge. And now I'm gonna take a nice fat 1/4 inch seam there to encase the first one so no raw edges will be showing. Now that the French seam is complete, I'm gonna go ahead and do just a simple 1/4 inch rolled hem on the bottom of the dress. And I usually just do that all here at the machine by turning and sewing. If you'd rather press a 1/4 inch hem all the way around the bottom first to get a crease before you start sewing, you can do that. Now that it's come time to attach this gathered skirt to the knit bodice, for one, they are two different types of materials, and also one is gathered and one is totally smooth and flat. So it's a perfect opportunity to take advantage of the awesome AccuFeed foot that comes with this machine, because it's gonna feed the 2 layers of fabric perfectly and evenly. To attach the skirt to the bodice, we're gonna flip the skirt wrong side out, leaving the bodice right side out, and kind of connect their 2 circular edges here. So a few key things to look for in attaching. The first thing is to make sure the side seam of the skirt is lined up with the side seam of the bodice. It really doesn't make a difference which direction you lay the skirt side seam. Also, all these drawstring threads that helped you gather up that skirt, pull them up and out of the way of your sewing. But once you have those edges lined up, you can pin. So that's the first pin I'm gonna put in, and it's also gonna be the second pin that I put in over here on the other side. Matching side seams. Let's get all those gathering threads up out of our way. And pin here. Now's the time to check and see how well the skirt width and the bodice width are matching up to each other. This actually looks pretty close. You can tug just a little bit at this gathered skirt top to get it to match the same width as your bodice. And of course, you can also mark the center of the bodice, mark the center of the skirt, and make sure that those line up. But I've done this so many times now, I've learned to just sort of eyeball. But you do want to smooth out the gathers. And again, leaving those gathering lines open and free allows you to gather further at this juncture in case you need to cinch it up even a little bit more. And that's all looking pretty nice and smooth. So I'm just going to start pinning all the way around. And then once I've done that, I can go attach the skirt to the bodice, which is really easy to do on the free arm of the machine. So you can smoothly turn the fabric around the machine as you stitch, because you want that 1/2 inch stitch line to fall right between your basting lines. And then after you've completed that seam all the way around, you can remove the basting lines. Another good reason not to tie them up in knots. Now that we have this beautiful little top and bottom sewn together for a sweet dress, the only thing left to consider is how you want to finish those sleeve cuffs. In the first example that I did this cute little 80s style cut-off sweatshirt roll-up, and I think I'm going to do that on this t-shirt material too. So you can turn it once, and then again. And then I just did a simple little back tack on the sewing machine through all those layers, sort of right in the side seam. And that's going to be plenty to keep that little rolled edge in place. This simple and snuggly silhouette is perfect to keep up with the growth of your little one, because maybe it's a dress one season and by the next it's going to be a top with leggings. But adding a little machine embroidery makes sure that it's special.